Hello everybody, welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. I'm Chloe, and if you make yourselves comfortable, I have a story to tell you. There was a time when most of England was covered in forest, and the part that we now know as the county of Warwickshire was a small kingdom all by itself. In one area of the forest, well, people were nervous of it. It was uncanny. There were shadows that moved. There were rustlings and whisperings and unseen creatures. And if you did go in, it felt as if 100 pairs of eyes were watching you every step you took. And people used to say, if you go into the wonderful wood, you might never come out again. And so most people avoided the place. The king at that time, I don't know if he was a good king, but he had some terrible habits. One of them was that he liked to go hunting, and I do not mean venison for the royal banqueting table. This was the king who liked to hunt young women, very young women. And when he'd finished with them, they didn't survive. So everyone who could afford to do so sent their daughters out of the kingdom to live safe somewhere else. But of course, not everyone could afford to do that. Every child, as soon as it was old enough, as soon as it was strong enough, every child had to earn its keep. They helped in the fields, they helped in the shop, they helped on the market stall. Right near the wonderful wood was a small holding, owned and run by an old lady, a widow. She had lived there most of her life. She knew the ways of the wonderful wood, and she was always safe and perfectly comfortable. She made a bit of money from sheep on her small holding. She sheared the wool, she washed and carded it and dyed the wool gorgeous colours with flowers and hedgerow plants, and a few times a year she would take baskets full of soft, squidgy, lanolin-smelling skeins of wool to market. The old woman had her granddaughter living with her on the small holding. The granddaughter helped as much as possible, and the old woman kept her safely hidden. But one autumn, as the big autumn market was coming up, the old lady was ill. She coughed and she wheezed and she had a fever, and by the end of it, she was so weak she could barely stagger across the farmyard, never mind do that very long day of carrying the wool to market and selling it and then walking home at the end of the day. But they needed the money, otherwise they would starve that winter. So the old woman called her granddaughter to her and she said, "My dear, I hate to have to ask you, but you are going to have to take the wool to market today. You got to make us a few coins, otherwise we're going to starve." And the girl was quite happy to be asked. It would be her first adventure. So she filled up the basket with skeins of wool. And then her granny said to her, "Now, you take my old brown cloak and you wrap that close around you and keep it wrapped around you all day. We don't want anyone seeing how pretty you are." And both the girl and the old woman knew who really had to be hidden from. And then Granny said, "Now, as you go past the wonderful wood, mind you stay on the track. I done it 100 times or more myself. Don't you step to right nor left. Don't you look too deep in the shadows, and you'll come safe past." The girl kissed her granny on the cheek, took the basket, flung the cloak around her, and set off, happy to be on her way on her way to her first adventure by herself. As she set out, it was a mild blue sky autumn morning with the first leaves turning, the first leaves coming down from the trees like soft floating golden coins. She splashed through a few puddles. But then from the valley down to the side there came the sound of hunting horns and hounds baying. The king and his courtiers were out hunting. The girl looked, she couldn't see them, and the sounds were not coming any closer, but she hurried up on her way. A few moments later, 3 deer came bounding across the track in front of her, and they were heading across the track into the first shadows of the wonderful wood, and then they stopped, scattering gravel from their little hooves, and their nostrils flared, and the birds called. And those deer would not go any further. They would not go down into the wonderful wood. They turned and bolted away down the track in front of the girl until they were out of sight. And now the hunting horns were sounding closer, and the girl speeded up her stride, and a moment later from behind her came the sound she dreaded most. There was one large horse's hooves crunching on the track. From under the hood of her cloak, she risked a look behind her, and you know who was riding that big white horse. Oh yes, and when the king saw the girl, he gave a shout of vicious joy and spurred after her. Now the girl was running, hanging on to the basket, nearly falling over the hem of Granny's cloak, just catching herself up in time and running on. And the horse was close. She could hear it snorting and pounding its hooves right behind her. There was only one thing left to do. She turned and jumped down off the track, away from the king, away from the hunt, running down into the wonderful wood itself. She only got a few strides before she was into brambles, and the more that she tried to wrench herself free, the more the thorns hung on to her cloak and her skirts. In her panic, the girl gasped aloud, please, you got to let me go. I got to get this wool to market and make money to see me and Granny through the winter. I love my Granny. I want to look after her. Please let me go. Was as if she spoke a spell or a prayer. The bramble thorns lifted clear, and the girl ran on. She dodged through the trees, and it was as if a curtain was drawn across behind her. All the sounds of the king shouting, the horse snorting, the hounds and the hunting horns behind, everything was muffled into silence. And a moment later the girl came to a clearing, in the middle of which was the most enormous oak tree she'd ever seen. Its canopy filled the clearing from one side to the other. The vast tree trunk would have taken 20, maybe 30 of us to stand around and join hands. And as the girl stopped to catch her breath, she looked up into the canopy. And there was a presence. There was a power in that ancient tree. She could feel that presence looking down at her and judging her. And though there was not a breath of wind that day, and the leaves starting to turn brown, there's a shivering, a rustling, a whispering as of many voices debating. The girl had listened to a lot of stories from her granny, and a lot of those stories were about the magic of the wonderful wood. And so now the girl kept a hold of her courage. She looked up into the canopy. She curtsied. She said, "Please, your majesty, king of the forest, I ask you to let me pass. I need to get this wool to market and sell it. I need to take this wool to market and make enough money to see me and Granny through the winter. My Granny has looked after me all my life. I love my Granny, and now it's my turn to take care of her. So please, Your Majesty, please let me pass." And there was a movement high up in the branches, though there was no wind that day. A whispering, a rustling. And then on the far side of the clearing, a path had opened up, a path that was not there a few moments before. And once again the girl bobbed a curtsy, gathered the cloak around her, held fast to the basket of wool, and she was gone, out, free, safe, along the path, on her way to market. So, that was all right, wasn't it? At the far side of the wonderful wood, there was the king on the big white horse, spurring it and beating it, trying to make it go off the path down into the wonderful wood. But the horse refused. It dug its hooves into the ground and would not budge, even when the king spurred its sides bloody. The king jumped down, left the horse there, drew his big sword and marched into the wonderful wood. The king didn't care about shadows. The king didn't care about watching eyes. He had a big sword. He had chainmail. He stomped through the brambles, and after a few moments, the king came to the clearing, and he too faced the gigantic oak tree. And the man who considered himself to be king of all that land faced the king of the forest and sensed that presence, sensed that power. And being the kind of man he was, red rage rose up inside the king. "I will catch her," he said, up into the canopy. "I will catch her, and I will have my sport, and not you nor any of your kind shall get in my way." The king hefted his sword as if it were an axe. He took a step forward, as if he were going to chop into that tree trunk. And that is when the whispering leaves became a fierce, raging hiss. And the twigs moved, and the branches reached down and seized the king by his grey hair. The roots came slithering out from the turf, seized the king by the ankles, by the knees. Twigs, branches, and roots held the king fast and then pulled. The king's screams echoed and echoed across the wonderful wood, and dark birds flew up and away in all directions. So, that was all right, wasn't it? At the edge of the wonderful wood, the king's horse heard the commotion, flung up its head and bolted. It galloped all the way back to the town, to the castle, to its stable. A search party was put together. In truth, not many people wanted to go looking for that king, but it was their duty. There were enough of them. There were guards, there were soldiers, there were huntsmen, and they were well armed. They had swords, they had crossbows, they had axes. They followed the horse's track back up to the wonderful wood, and they all went in. The first man into the clearing, a big, tough soldier, he took one look and he had to turn away, because there was the king's head, dangling by its hair from a branch, eyes wide open, mouth open in its final scream. The other men came rushing in, and there, all across the clearing, hanging from branches, were bits and pieces of the king, to which he had been very attached, but not any more. And red rage rose up inside those men, and they hefted their weapons. They encircled that huge tree trunk, and they stepped forward, and they began to chop and to hack into the wood. and the leaves hissed, and the branches reached down, the roots came reaching out to snag them. Battle was joined. The fight went back and forth. It could have gone either way for many minutes. Then the tree gave a groan and summoned its own. All around the edge of the clearing, the lesser trees heaved up on their roots and closed in. And not one man who went into the wonderful wood that day ever came out again. So, that was all right, wasn't it?